I'm Megan Westerby. I'm the head of research and audience insights for MWM. MWM is a multimedia company that is creating media across many forms of content and audience engagement. I am here to be able to pull in more traditional research when a project is either in development or in production that will help it head towards audience touchpoint. The part that I think is very unique about my position and wonderful and forward-thinking on behalf of our founders is that I also get to be involved in the active audience engagement and development when a project is live. And what you're not doing is releasing something and waiting months and months and getting back, but you're seeing what your audience is doing on a day-to-day basis and how you're either evolving the IP or the tactics that you're using to talk to your audience. My journey started with me not knowing what I wanted to do at all in life. It started with me saying, I have graduated from a liberal arts college, but I care deeply about technology. And there is no field out there that I see as balancing the two parts of my personality in a way that is sustainable for a lifetime. And so I kicked around not quite knowing what to do, but then also being curious about what was happening in the world. And I do feel that I got lucky in that I was on a college campus that had access to Facebook very early on in Facebook's cycle of existing, and it changed everything. I know that there were so many think pieces over the course of time about how Web 2.0 changed things, but Facebook really did. Not to say people weren't on the internet and not to say people weren't connecting with each other, but Facebook gave people a chance to connect and share their lives, and it really did change campus culture in a dramatic and significant and short way. And I'd been on that campus long enough, between both being an undergrad there and then working there, to know that campus culture doesn't change that quickly. So seeing everything change in one semester told me that something was happening in how people were using the internet to talk to each other that was different than what had happened before and what I grew up with in a family that was luckily on the internet very early. So I said, there's something happening here and I don't know what it is, and I don't know anyone who would trust me to do something with it, but I'm going to try to do something anyway. So I took some basically empirical evidence on my own observational skills and said, I'm gonna go out there and try to find a job in entertainment. And it took a while, but the CMO of the Recording Academy, Evan Green, and the Recording Academy also happens to do a little thing called the Grammys, said to me, I don't know if this is gonna work, but I really wanna try. And I did 3 shows in 3 years and had a really amazing early peek at what it was like for people to say, I'm an evangelist of something, but also I just personally align with this in my life. Very rarely has there been a position, a department that unites either traditional research or the ability to look at audience insights with the action-oriented components of marketing communications. So there's been this development of things called community managers, social media managers, social media marketing managers. There's a whole intermediary layer that is basically borrowed the conventions and the titles from either marketing or communications that encompasses a lot of what audience insights and engagement can be, but doesn't necessarily cover all of it. In the Venn diagram, there's like what you could do with audience engagement from a direct-to-consumer standpoint, and then there's what marketing and communications have tried to traditionally do, and that don't encompass what you could do, which is why brands are now borrowing a lot of direct-to-consumer tactics and either managing to entirely own a category or fall behind and then try to catch up in a category later. There are a lot of ways in which you can train people easily to understand conversion metrics and to optimize for sales, but it's not easy to train people to have the curiosity or just the ability to sit down and think from dozens of different angles about what people might love about something in the future, because what it involves is that creative forecasting of what you would personally want and then what you would not want but someone else might want. And that type of creative thinking isn't what MBAs are traditionally trained to do. They're trained to really think through ROI, and they're trained to really think about the business impact on a company. And when you're talking about audience insights and we're talking about audience development, it fundamentally becomes a creative endeavor through analytics. There are a lot of tools and services that will help you look at social media, and particularly look at sentiment on social media, and definitely look at volume on social media. And there's this sense that the number of followers is incredibly important. The engagement is incredibly important. And the truth is, by platform, you have to look at norms for different sub-communities on what your goals are and not just flatten everything into one large metric. So you need to look at the difference in communication style between Twitter and Instagram. You need to look at the difference in creative options. You need to look at the difference between Reddit and Tumblr of how people talk about things, why people talk about things. Is it more of a text culture? Is it more of a visual culture? What are your expectations of even entering a space and creating something or talking about something? How do you live by the norms? How do you purposely break the norms if that's going to be helpful to you? And how you preset what your analytics are going to be for those different environments. Because making money off of ads is also tied to programming media choices. And agencies have, a really big lock on creative and even programmatic decision making for how ads are deployed and where money is being spent. And what happens then is some poor media planner has to look at a spreadsheet and say, this was the effectiveness of our advertising campaign. So they flatten all the metrics into one big lump sum of, this is how well we delivered for you on a campaign. So when you're not getting deep into, you don't just want to know how well, Google ads performed against Facebook ads. You want to say, what were your creative choices? What was the timing of your ad? What was the copy in it? How did those all change? Did you try things at two different audiences? Did you try things at different times of day? What was the relevancy of what you were saying? You need to be really thinking through that matrix and not just relying on flat bulk metrics. It's actually incredibly difficult because the world is geared towards simplicity, and you can define a flat metric very easily. But when you're losing all that nuance of how something performed organic versus paid, when you're losing the nuance of how something performed on one platform versus another and what the norms are on those platforms, you're really missing out. When you're looking at being either a company or any type of entity that wants to have a direct-to-consumer relationship, or you want to have a brand story, you can do some of it through ads. But the world we're living in now is one where, thanks to social platforms and the ideal and the reality of influencers, we're at a point where people's emotions are a much bigger part of their relationship to the day-to-day media that they're consuming. So, and agencies tend to still go by more traditional print media, radio, television norms for both what content they create and how they're deploying it. So I've been talking a lot about what has previously existed in entertainment. And I'm going to talk a little bit now about what I love about what MWM is doing. From an audience perspective, there's not actually a difference between when you love something as a Marvel comic and as a Marvel movie. There's, how much you're paying for it, and there's who you might be going to a movie to versus how you're reading a comic alone. For audiences, and for when you really love something as IP, the relationship is about your love for that story or those characters. It's not about how the company is making money off of you as a fan. So what I really love about MWM is there's this understanding that the true thing that you can really develop and foster is someone's love of a character, a story, a person, a world. I just made a musical, and honestly, that probably took 6 years, but I just made a musical. But let's also think about the podcast version of this. Let's also think about one of these characters and their side story and what we could do with that. Let's also think about what it looks like in a gaming environment, in a VR headset, as an interactive in-person experience. Let's think about all those other things as we're even developing the first thing, so we can think about how the audience could have a lifetime appreciation of this. And at scale, that's very difficult, in part because you're dealing with very big IP. But it's also difficult because you lose the ability to really listen closely to what your audience is thinking. When you have a massive audience for something, all of the small little opinions and what something really means to someone's life and their emotional journey start to flatten out into marketing KPIs. You put stuff out there to enrich the story world, not because it's necessarily going to have a direct conversion to making you money, but it allows people to feel really emotionally tied to something that you can then later on have the goodwill of using that emotional tie to say, all right, do you want to join us on this next stage of the journey? So I have a friend who, his name's Jay Bushman, and he has this belief that broadcast media was an aberration, because what humans really like is to connect to each other and see themselves reflected in the stories they're both telling and hearing. Not everyone is a storyteller. Not everyone wants to be a director, creator, own a conversation, but people like to see themselves reflected and see and hear conversations in their daily lives that they're actually a part of. And that can be called agency and storytelling, and it can be called agency for the audience. But what it really is, in my mind, is just recognizing that we're human and we want to be part of something that we actually feel emotionally tied to. So giving people agency in a story versus agency in an audience and a community are two different things. From one perspective, agency in a story is saying, all right, what's the next story beat? Where is someone going next? Generate UGC to be part of this. But agency in a community just means that when you're able to express an opinion, when you're able to have a conversation, you're going to be heard and you're going to be seen as part of something that enriches your life. Two of the things that we have done recently that I think have been amazing and are really good for how you start something small, but use audience engagement that is not necessarily paid media to really get people emotionally on board for something is with our immersive division, which has had 2 location-based VR experiences. The 2 experiences we have are wildly different creatively. And in function, how you're onboarded into the experience in terms of when in the experience you put the headset on and how in the experience you relate to either actors or the physical space are different, but they're the same in that they're not like anything else in the space right now. We took the tactic of we don't have a high throughput, we don't have a high need to have a massive consumer audience for this at this stage. Let's just figure out what people are responding to about the story, how we could scale the project, and gathering just enough information from the type of person who likes this to understand that if we want to scale, if we want to go in a new direction, we can take that audience awareness to do that more effectively. This is where you get into the more technical side and you figure out what your KPIs are, and they're low. They're making sure you have enough ticket sales for an in-person experience. And when you're doing boutique VR experiences, it's not going to be that high. But then you also think about, okay, who are the core people who will probably be emotionally engaged in this? And for one, the story was a retelling of A Christmas Carol, but with a lot of the feel that you get coming out of interactive theater. So you're in a tech space, you're in a tech headset, but you're going through a very emotional core story. So we thought, what are the psychotypes of people who will really appreciate this? What are the early adopters for VR experiences or locker room experiences or those types of things? How do we go out and organically start having conversations in those spaces and reach the people who like really are going to care about this early on, who could fundamentally also help us make it better? Like give us feedback, tell us what the experience is like for them, but then also with a somewhat expert eye, say what could make it even better if it were their first time going through something. So the first one is called Chained, a Victorian Nightmare. And it is a retelling of A Christmas Carol where you go through and you first interact in person with an actor in a set that is decorated like a Victorian receiving room. And then after you're onboarded into the headset through that character, you're pulled through a mirror and into the story of A Christmas Carol. When you go to the second part of Chained, when you leave the physical environment behind and go into the virtual environment, you're acting against an actor in a motion capture suit who's playing multiple characters and who's everyone on the other side of the story. You don't realize that though, because what you are is in a virtual environment in a headset, going through a story, and there's just enough interaction with the real world that you feel very grounded, but everything around you and in that headset is moving very quickly through time and space and story. But what we were paying attention to as a department was, what are people saying on social media when they leave the experience? What are people thinking in person when they get out of it? Like, is there a way to have some type of quick exit survey that doesn't disrupt the emotional connection to what you just went through? And what is the long-term impact? Are people talking about it days later? Are they like so obsessed with it that they're organically saying something about it? And when they do, are we interacting? I feel very lucky in that when I was hired, it was with an understanding that I have skills that borrow from effectively would have been different backgrounds in entertainment. So we were able to put something together that focused on what does it mean to both quantitatively and qualitatively look at audiences from different perspectives, look at social, look at search, look at surveys, look at the traditional stuff, but then also have a fresh perspective at looking what is available either in a more digital environment or what is not traditionally thought of as something you look at as part of audiences. And what I found is that there's not one thing you deliver on behalf of any project. It's based on a really intense briefing process we go through where we say, help us answer better questions by helping us get better questions from you for what is important for this project. So we walk in with a baseline understanding of, okay, this is the media that we're thinking about now, and this is what is important traditionally for that medium. So the difficult part of what we do is that nothing is out of the box, nothing is standardized. On every single project, we basically have a checklist of what might or might not be helpful, and let's figure out if we should be tracking that. Unsurprisingly, people love social data because it's a very quick, easy hit, and they love website traffic. So there's a lot of, we want these dashboards just because we want the dashboards, but then let's also benchmark moments where we're going to sit down and understand what was actually happening during that time period in a real basis. So there's a lot of effectively exported dashboards with a narrative laid on top of them of what is happening outside of the volume of the data. And we can either do projected ones where we can say, here's what has happened with a comp, where, okay, here's the peaks and valleys in the data, but here was what the actual narrative was of what was happening in that community. And here's how the tactics of what was happening in that community contributed to that narrative. Adding that narrative on top of it helps you understand that these are real people and not just figures on a spreadsheet. So when I was hired, there was an understanding of we want to look qualitatively and quantitatively, and we want to understand that content creation is separate from audience development. So my team is actually split between someone who focuses on quantitatively looking at audiences and someone who qualitatively focuses on looking at audiences. So one person spends a lot of time building dashboards, I feel quite bad for him sometimes. And the other person spends a lot of time deep in the comments in different forums on different platforms, seeing what the meta narrative of a fandom is actually doing and how that does and does not line up to the more traditional graphs and charts and what have you that's coming out of something. Really, almost everything about audience engagement, and I mean, managing expectations is one of the oldest cliches, but a lot of it, what it is making people internally more comfortable with having conversations around audiences and analytics and thinking of people as people rather than as generic consumers. When I was aiming to hire my audience development manager, most everyone was like, what does this mean? So I spent a lot of time explaining what it wasn't. And we got a lot of applications from people who had been marketing managers, copywriters. And what I was looking for was someone who had experience really qualitatively looking at an audience, but also in understanding a high volume of content creation and publishing, because what a high volume means is that you're testing different variables. So it didn't matter effectively what industry they came out of. I wanted to have an understanding that someone was used to throwing stuff at a wall to see what sticks, but that you have to throw good stuff at a wall and not crap. So when we then turned to trying to find interns for our program, even internally it was, oh, well, we'll get you a marketing intern. And that's not what we were looking for. And the words you use really do matter. Marketing has gone through this slippery slope of being agency focused. And then there was the idea of your ad placement versus your ad copy and your ad creative, and needing those three things staffed and filled. And as we've gone in this direction where you can test all of those faster, and all of those have a much more immediate impact on your audience and on your brand, the model of thinking through things and having split teams doesn't work as well as having someone who's just trying to synthesize everything in one place. So when you're thinking marketing, there is the paid, earned, owned triangle of it, and you have a sense of what you could be doing in two of those as a normal function of the industry. And then in the third, the earned, you really have to work for it if you want to develop something. And I feel like audience development is pulling that out and saying, let's expand on just the generic term earned and figure out what it means to have not only an authentic relationship with an audience, but a long-term one where you're pre-thinking through what will be beneficial to them through time. It means that when you're able to express an opinion, when you're able to have a conversation, you're going to be heard and you're going to be seen as part of something that enriches your life. And finding opportunities for that.
Awesome.
Okay.
Can we cut for a second and make
Good.
a little adjustment?
Yeah.